Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see the turnout here for this session today, not just because we have a terrific panel with us, but I think it's a subject that many of us feel very strongly about. So I'm really glad you've come out in big numbers. So the timing of this session is very interesting because we are now a couple of months away from India's general election, which of course by itself is a mammoth exercise, the largest in the world. We are still technically the world's largest democracy. And so a lot of people, Indrajit Roy, are going to turn to you and say, well, you know, we have elections. We have state elections. We have general elections. Isn't that what democracy is about? And the BJP doesn't win all state elections. It loses them as well. So why are you talking about the erosion of democracy? You don't see TV stations being taken over by soldiers. You don't see tanks on the streets. What creeping authoritarianism are you talking about?
So that's an excellent question, Nidhi, and thank you everyone for coming for this amazing, I'm amazed at the audience here, and thank you for leading with that question. So we often think of democracy as only about elections, as only about free and fair elections. Now that's an important part of democracy, but democracy is also about treating each other with respect. Democracy is not about imposing the will of the majority, but it's about taking everyone together, respecting the minorities, no matter how they are divided, no matter how they are outlined. And it's about reaching out across political ideas and political thoughts. So one sees an erosion of the respect and the idea of equality in India over the last few years, one would say, especially the idea that India belongs to one group and others are excluded from it is taking root. You see this not only in terms of the ideas that the ruling party has, but also in terms of their practices. You see controls over diets, for instance. You see the whole idea of amending your citizenship laws in ways that accommodate some and exclude others. And of course, most recently, you've seen how the Prime Minister himself has been very closely involved with the institutions of one religious group and not the others. Now, it would be an interesting thing to see if the Prime Minister would sort of extend the same courtesy to other groups, other religious groups, when their places of worship are inaugurated. I'm not sure that will happen. We don't know. We'll have to find out. So that's the reason I'm talking about democracy eroding. You have regular elections, but you have a tendency now of imposing the will of the majority, which is not what a democracy is about.
Absolutely. And what you also have, Shashi Tharoor, which you have seen up close, is an institutional decay. You're seeing it in Parliament, which now meets less frequently. There are fewer bills that are scrutinized by parliamentary committees. There are fewer debates and discussions. You see it in the judiciary, and unfortunately, that goes right up to the Supreme Court. And you see it, very unfortunately, in the institution that I represent, which is the media. This institutional decay, how serious do you think that is in terms of India's democratic future?
Extremely, because I think one of the important efforts of successive governments in the first 6.5 decades after independence was in building up these institutions to give them the kind of credibility and the kind of value that would make democracy entrenched, not only structurally, but in the habits and expectations of the people. You talked about elections in your first question, Nidhi. There's no doubt that this is the one saving grace, if you like, and yet you've got the respected VDEM Institute in Sweden, the Varieties of Democracy Institute, deciding to call us not a democracy anymore, but an electoral autocracy. That is, that we elect our leaders, but then they behave like autocrats. And I'm reminded of Jayaprakash Narayan when he first quit electoral politics in the early 1950s, saying that he did so because he feared that elections would amount to a bunch of sheep electing their shepherd, who would essentially then push them around. And his prophecy, sadly, has come true in many ways today. So we have to accept that elections alone are not enough. The institutions are what give body and strength to our democracy, whether it's parliament, whether it's an independent election commission that is immune to governmental influence, whether it's the newly created institutions like the Information Commission after the passage of the Right to Information Act, or the old institutions like the Reserve Bank of India, which are supposed to be statutorily independent of government policy. All of these institutions have found their independence vitiated. And now we are seeing the governments being quite shameless about misusing even those institutions that are directly under it but were meant to have a certain amount of independence, like the Enforcement Directorate and the CBI and the other law enforcement bodies, because they were meant to chase wrongdoers without fear or favor. They're now being unleashed selectively only on those whom the BJP, the ruling party, deems to be its political opponents. So given that, we are looking at a genuine crisis of democratic institutions in our country. All of these institutions that I mentioned and more have been undermined either in their functioning or in their appointment and their terms of service, or in the ways in which the government has tended to use them or not allow them to be used.
But can I just follow up on that, back to you, Shashi Tharoor, which is that, okay, I think all governments have a tendency to want to control the narrative or spin things their own way or generally, control the way things are going, right? Governments have a tendency to do that even in democracies. But then we were supposed to have checks and balances. And the media and the judiciary were an important part of that institutionally. I could have a separate discussion with you on what's happened to the media, but the judiciary in particular, as a citizen, I am outraged by how it has let us down, right up to the Supreme Court, where a bail plea of an Omar Khalid gets adjourned now 13 times, and he has spent years in jail without trial. So where do we turn to? Which institution do we go to for relief? Because you can't depend on the judiciary anymore.
It certainly seems that way in large number of cases, in the sense that the judiciary only seems to show courage on issues which don't matter very much to the government. And on other matters, they will be a little more quiescent. But the media is no exception, Nidhi. You've all been either cajoled or cudgelled into seeing the merits of the government's point of view on every issue.
That's why I left.
When not you, the profession as a whole. You've been cudgelled a bit, but you haven't been cajoled. Having said that, you also have the situation where the media isn't directly in a position to support a government narrative, it instead plays the role of serving as a weapon of mass distraction. Something is going wrong that can't be hidden. What you do instead is you build up a narrative about a totally trivial side story that dominates all the headlines and diverts the attention of the public from the real failure of the government on a particular issue. It's been working extremely well for the government. I'm not at all surprised that they are seen as dominating the narrative in these circumstances.
But Indrajit Roy, in the book, you have written extensively about, and you've documented the kind of resistance from citizens, whether it's farmer protests or Dalits or protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And just to be the devil's advocate here, is there a risk of romanticizing these protests? And I say this because if you look at even the CAA protests, young students, who thought that they were standing up for what was right, ended up being thrown behind bars under this draconian anti-terror law called the UAPA, where you don't get bail for years if you do get bail, right? So they've paid a very heavy price for these protests. So is there a danger of romanticizing protest in India today?
Absolutely. I mean, I would not want this work to be read as romanticizing protests. But I would say it's better to romanticize protests than romanticize the government, which is the tendency in a lot of our institutions that you've talked about. These students knew what they were getting into, and they went ahead. And I think we need to appreciate their bravery, their courage, knowing what they were up against. And of course, in some cases, these sort of laws were thrown against them. They didn't know the severity of things, maybe. But we should not undermine their agency in be willing to take on a government when every other institution had failed them, as you've pointed out. So I think there is something to be said about not romanticizing protests, but I think we also need to appreciate and understand that the protesters are just fed up with what's going on. The protesters know that the institutions, including, with respect, some of the political parties that should be acting as the opposition, aren't clearly up to the tasks, so they want to take this on themselves.
No, so to follow up on that, one of the interesting things in your book is criticism of the opposition, and you've been critical of Rahul Gandhi in particular, where you said that he came to England, for example, where you teach, and was very passionate when he spoke about the state of Indian democracy, and yet you were disappointed that he didn't really offer people a roadmap of, okay, what is he going to do, or what is the Congress going to do to respect these institutions, to restore them, to what they once were. Maybe we were never perfect institutionally, but we were not in the situation that we are in today. Is it fair to put it on the opposition, to put that burden on the opposition in a sense, when this hasn't come from them?
Sure, I mean, I completely agree. In my defense, that little bit about Rahul Gandhi comes to the very end, whereas a large part of the start is, talking about the sorts of decays that you mentioned. But I do think the opposition has a role. Of course, the opposition has a role. And one of the reasons I was really disappointed with that talk was everything was about going back. What we've done in the past, the sort of legacy we carry, poverty reduction, going back. And those are important things, of course. But what's going to happen with the future? Talking about employment is not enough at a time when you have artificial intelligence, which will change the way the world of work is going to appear to us. So you have to think creatively about what's going to come next, not harp on bringing back or restoring the past. And I think some of us wanted that vision, a forward-looking vision, not hackneyed promises that people have heard in the past, but something new, something different. And I think when we think about hope, hope is not just passively waiting for someone to deliver you, but actively thinking about what next. And in that sense, I think Indian citizens have sort of outstripped both government and opposition in terms of thinking about what they want next. I was, for those reasons, extremely disappointed.
Yeah, I do want to take that up, Nidhi. I mean, I enjoyed Indrajit's book entirely, though I think on that particular segment and the conclusions he's drawn from it, I think reveal the limitations of drawing rather big conclusions from a series of speeches in England. I mean, the fact is there is action happening in India that Indrajit, I think, was not aware of. For example, on the CAA, I don't want to diminish in any way the extraordinary efforts of the ordinary protesters right across the country. I mean, starting with Shaheen Bagh, and I'm proud to have been the first politician to have gone to Shaheen Bagh and addressed the grandmothers and all the others who were there. And I have no regrets about that. But equally, obviously, there were office goers in every city in India who came out. But what Indrajit is not aware, for example, is that the Congress Party actually did conduct its own protests against the CAA throughout the country. I personally inaugurated and addressed 7 such protests in my state of Kerala in 7 different cities. So it's not that the opposition was sort of absent without leave from these issues. These are issues that mattered. And I must say that for many of us, the CAA was a fundamental problem because it was not only the practice which Indrajit has already alluded to of sort of othering the Muslims of our country, but it was actually attacking them on something that every one of us have a right to take for granted, which is our citizenship. And saying that somehow you're a lesser citizen than people of other faiths was such a fundamental assault that a lot of people rose up in protest against that. And if it weren't for COVID and the lockdown, those protests were continuing till that very day. I just wanted to add also that that as far as the opposition is concerned, we can do what we can do, but ultimately in a democracy, it's the votes that matter. And ultimately, your future is in your hands. All of you, those of you who have a vote in this country, will you bother to exercise it, please? Because a lot of people, we have a pretty dismal percentage turnout in our country by the standards of most democracies. I mean, there are very mature democracies like the US which are behind us. But when you look at most other robust democracies, a larger number of people do take the trouble to go and express their views at the voting stations than we do in our country. And it's something which I do want to turn around to people and say, yes, those who protest are indeed exercising agency, have been empowered by these. And indeed, I think Indrajit has done a very comprehensive survey of every single major protest movement that the present government has encountered in the last 10 years. But at the same time, if that's not translating into votes at the ballot box, then indeed, of course, the government feels it has a license from the people of India to do exactly what they've been doing so far.
And that's true, I agree. I mean, people should go out and exercise their right to vote. It is important, and I don't think you have a right to complain if you're not taking the trouble to go out and cast your vote. I completely agree. But Shashi Tharoor, we've also heard voices from the ruling party and the government over the last few years that have started talking about this notion of an Indian concept of democracy. We don't have to, mold ourselves to what the West has preached about democracy, and therefore, this troublesome thing like human rights and all. And we talk about duties and not rights. How do you see that? Because now that there's an attempt to shift the definition of what democracy should be or is.
Well, there isn't one standard definition, other than the broad thing that democracy is ruled of by and for the people, and that the people determine who rules them. The actual rules of the game vary from democracy to democracy. And there is no reason why each country couldn't have its own. But we have chosen a system which is enshrined in our constitution, and until the constitution is amended, we have to make that system work the way it's supposed to. Now, you've got a situation like, say, Switzerland, where every party elected to parliament participates in the government, so there is no opposition. There are 7 parties in government, there are 7 major things, and the presidency rotates every year. That's very democratic, and they make major decisions by referenda in Switzerland. But should we adopt that system? Should we do a variation of it? What is, the Indian tradition? There are multiple Indian traditions of democratic rule and not so democratic rule, and we will have to distill from them what we can. Dr. Ambedkar was very inspired in many ways by the old sort of Buddhist sanghas, and where people were free and able to speak, and he thought that was a very important thing. He did read up ancient Indian history, but ultimately the form of democracy we've chosen is essentially a version of the Westminster system of government. Now, that's what we've got. We've got to try and make it work truly. But as you were saying in one of your earlier remarks, Nidhi, we've got a parliament where I'm not trying to just play political points, but when the UPA was in power, over 80% of the bills that came to Parliament were first referred to a parliamentary committee. With Mr. Modi coming to power, that dropped to 16% in his first term and is not much better in the second. And the problem we've got, therefore, is that the opposition doesn't get a chance to express a view, a voice, propose serious amendments, and in the actual debate, we know the government has a crushing majority and can pass a bill saying literally anything it wants because it has the majority to do so. That has reduced Parliament to a kind of rubber stamp or a notice board for the government's statements and decisions. It's no longer an institution that, as Ambedkar envisaged, would have been a deliberative forum that would have held the government accountable. It simply ceased to be that. And that's something which obviously worries and should worry all of us. Not every one of you is going to be willing to go out on the streets and protest, as in all these protests chronicled in Indrajit's book, Audacious Hope. But at least, you should be able to feel that the people you voted for have an opportunity to do so meaningfully inside the house, and you can watch it on TV and tell them whether you agree with them or not or whatever. That sense of an ongoing, we have an election every 5 years, and then it seems as if we are expected to forget our democratic rights in the 5 years in between. That can't work. You've really got to keep your elected representatives accountable between all of this, and you've got to keep the government accountable through them. It's your right.
I want to open this up for questions in another 2 minutes, so that I'm sure there are lots of questions for both of you. And Indrajit Roy, the sense that I get after reading your book is you're basically telling us India is just too big, it's too diverse to allow its democracy to be snatched away from it. We've been through the emergency, we saw what happened after that, and is that what you're trying to say? That Indians ultimately are democratic and will not give up their rights so easily?
Absolutely. Thank you for that close reading. I want to go back a bit in the past, because when India became independent in 1947, nobody expected the country to survive, much less survive as a democracy. There were predictions that India would either crumble, break up, or it would need an authoritarian leader to hold it together. There were predictions that Nehru would be such an authoritarian, or that others would take over power. None of that happened. in the 1967 elections, when the Congress party lost power in several states, there were predictions in the West that now this is the end of India. I think people were talking about India's last democratic elections.
Neville Maxwell in the London Times said that.
Yeah. So, exactly. But the Indians held true to their democracy. When Mrs. Gandhi imposed the emergency, we all know what happened. So, more than saying India is too diverse, etc., it's really Indians who have a sense of what rights are, as you said, and who are quite clear that they're not going to be allowing this wool to be pulled over their eyes about, there being one Indian way of democracy, because there are several Indian ways of doing politics. Protests are an integral part of Indian culture and traditions, and let no one tell you otherwise. We've had these protests, whether they are protests between Brahminism and Buddhism of the sort that you mentioned, or protests against empires, whether Mauryan, Gupta, or Mughal, there have been resistance against the state all the time. And I don't think that's about to disappear. So yes, Indians are very, very conscious of the fact that they have a stake, or they have to have a stake in government.
Can I quickly ask you, as a follow-up to that, Shashi Tharoor, then what do you make of the RWA uncles who are writing letters and telling people that you can't protest and leave the colony and things like that?
I don't think they're really
Where
business
do
to do
they
that.
fit in?
I mean, it's kind of a bizarre distortion of democracy, isn't it? Though the funny footnote to, they're doing that to Manishankar Ayer's daughter Sunena, is that she doesn't live in the colony that they want her to leave. So she's already obliged them without trying. Let me just briefly touch on something that I didn't get to, which was when Indrajit talked about looking to the future. I'm proud to say we in the opposition have been actually spending some time thinking seriously about what should go into our manifesto. I myself am in the manifesto committee. We want to come back to the people with very specific ideas and to say to them, and these are ideas we want to get from people themselves. I've been holding some consultations. I did so in Calcutta and in Tiruvananthapuram. Other colleagues are doing in other cities. We want to come back with ideas we've gleaned from the thinking public about what you'd like to see in a government of tomorrow. And we're going to put that before you in the manifesto. So we are looking to the future too, Indrajit.
All right, let's open this up to the audience and to the young lady in the front here. We're just getting a mic to you, please. I promise to look in the back as well.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Hold it closer, though.
Yeah. So we are here talking about the larger picture, of course, but isn't it trickling down to other parts? So to the state governments, for example, I would just talk about one, but I think we have many examples. So Aam Aadmi Party in Punjab, media persons' Twitter accounts or Facebook accounts are banned for some time because they don't fit the narrative of the government, or they have tweeted something that doesn't fit the government's narrative. And then there are other, many examples of that happening in Punjab, and we see RTIs, how the government is trying to control the narrative. You know it, I know it, I think many people know it here through advertisements and all sorts of things, and I've seen that happening. So shouldn't we talk about that also? Because it's easier to promise freebies and get the votes, and probably they'll win an election again on the free electricity and all of that. But nothing has changed on the ground.
I think the question really is that, if you look at Indian politics, not just the BJP, but she's actually right. When you look at different state governments as well, there is a tendency, I say all governments want to control the narrative, but, they're not exactly the most democratic when it comes to, or champions of a free press. And that's a fact.
Which is why the book is not about state governments and how they might sort of be a check on Delhi, but it's about popular movements and the protests of the kinds that you were mentioning against not only the central government, but also their respective state governments. But obviously, the Indian Union is much larger than Indian states, so the book has to focus on some things. Publishers set a finite number of things, pages, that one has to fit everything into, so which is why the focus is on the Indian Union. But you're right, all of this could be said about states as well, which is why it is, at the end of the day, people's protests that matter more than the sorts of checks that you were mentioning. Thanks.
By the way, I can reveal that it's more than one political party that threatened to withdraw advertisements from the NDTV of the pre-Adani era. So if anyone wants to know who that is, I'll tell you separately. But the gentleman, sorry, in the back. Yes, sir, please, go ahead.
My question is one to the media and one to Dr. Tharoor. To the media, We had a situation when Kappan was hauled up on his way to Hathras when he was going to visit a girl who had been murdered, who had been raped and murdered. And the entire thing was hidden by the government. This journalist was hauled up and spent 2 years behind bars. He was only released after he had COVID. And it took him 2 years, but we saw nothing from the media. The media didn't say anything. And Dr. Tharoor, my question to you is, are we looking at a majoritarian constitution? That's all.
Well, let me also address the first part of your question, because this is actually, I'm pretty proud of the fact that I opposed the UAPA when it was introduced on the Lok Sabha, and I warned precisely of this, that it was too easy now for the government to label anybody as suspected terrorists and deny them their constitutional rights, including bail. And of course, I was shouted down by the BJP majority, but it's on record. And as far as Kappan is concerned, I raised this case repeatedly, not only in social media. I spoke to his wife, and indeed, he was very briefly released once to attend to his ailing mother, who then passed away. And then he finally, as you say, got bail after more than 2 years in prison. And there's something very, very nasty about UAPA and the way it's applied. It was sold to the nation as something directed against terrorists. And so far it's been applied to everyone from journalists to student protesters. I'm not aware of a single genuinely suspected terrorist, somebody who can kill or somebody who was attempting to kill, who has fallen afoul of UAPA, but lots of dissidents have. On the majoritarian constitution, it's ironic. I mean, my penultimate book, not the one that just came out, but the one that came out the previous year, was on Ambedkar. And he specifically said that we have to understand democracy is not just about the rule of the majority, that the majority has to take the minority into account. And he said that's particularly important in a political majority. But he says right now what's even more worrying is we have a communal majority. And the communal majority has to be that much more respectful of the interests of minorities. Ambedkar said this 70 years ago, almost 75 years ago, in the Constituent Assembly. And he had a very, very clear sense of how easily these institutions and majorities could be distorted. And yes, indeed, it's our duty to resist that happening right now. Not just the drift, the very firm direction towards majoritarianism, and in a very triumphalist way, too.
I just want to briefly take your point on the media. Firstly, there were some of us who did speak up for Siddique Kappan. There were. You may not see it on mainstream channels or some of the mainstream newspapers. And while I have a very grim view of where the Fourth Estate stands today, I think the hope for me lies in those independent journalists, those who are online, those who are in the digital space in particular, who are still sticking their necks out and asking questions and holding those in power to account, which is what journalists are supposed to do. So I think that is where I still derive hope from, not really from the rest. Can we go to the back? Can we get the young lady, glasses, white sweatshirt? You can stand up. Yeah. Sorry, I'm partial to the women in the audience.
Good.
So, democracy not only requires a strong government, but a strong opposition as well. With major leaders leading the main INDA bloc, then as a common citizen, we are left in the dilemma, if not Modi, then who?
Yeah, that's a fun question. Look, I mean, I think the answer that the India bloc has been consistently giving is, you vote in a majority of members of the opposition and we will find a leader. And, no, wait a minute. It's very clear that each of the parties has their own leader and that any leader will have their own ambitions and desires. And it's also very clear that I'm not going to sit here and name one name and create a political controversy. So if that's what you want, I'm not going to do it. Having said that, let's also point out that this has happened before in the past. During the 25 years of coalition rule, from 89 to 2004, what do we see? Did you expect ever to see Mr. Devagowda as Prime Minister, or Mr. Gujral as Prime Minister, or Mr. Manmohan Singh, Dr. Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister? These things all happened unexpectedly without people necessarily having voted with that particular individual in mind. They voted for the policies of the parties these people represented, or they voted against the policies of those who were in government. and the opposition then came up with a name. Don't sneer at that. It's the way our system works. Again, we've got the parliamentary system in our constitution. Let it function the way it's supposed to.
But just to follow up to that, India of 2024 is not the India of 2004. I covered that election when Mr. Vajpayee unexpectedly lost. There was an India Shining campaign, if you remember. By the way, the opposition had no prime ministerial face. Even they were shocked that they won. I mean, the Congress was shocked. So it took 10 days for Dr. Manmohan Singh's name to be proposed. It's actually true. I've covered this as a reporter. But we are increasingly becoming very personality-oriented. And the fact is that Mr. Modi is a huge personality, a big plus point for the BJP. Is it not a disadvantage for the opposition that it doesn't have one face that it can say will take him on in what is increasingly a personality-driven...
Let me react to that directly. We don't have a presidential system. In some ways, I wish we did. Many of you may know I've been arguing the case for 25 years, but no one's been listening. I do believe it probably suits the genius of the Indian people far more. But it doesn't matter. We don't have one. We have a parliamentary system, and right now we have the worst of both worlds, because we have a parliamentary system being run presidentially, which actually has completely etiolated our democratic rights and institutions. Having said that, in answer to Nidhi, I'm going to resurrect the slogan of our 2014 campaign that I think deserves to be remembered and resurrected. I will certainly be using it. And that's very simple. Main nahi hum. We have heard too much of main, I, myself, for the last 10 years. It's all been about one individual, one person, the great hero on the white stallion who's going to go off and cut with his big sword and cut through all the Gordian knots of all our problems, and we know how well he's done or not done, right? So the answer is, let's instead give you an alternative style of leadership, where there's a whole cross-section of experienced, qualified leaders who will come and listen to you, will have the humility not to talk about themselves, but to talk about you, what your problems are, what you need, and attempt to solve them.
How's that
That's
been
what we'll
going?
do.
How's that been going in the India Alliance?
It's the only way. It's the only way. Vote and we'll tell you.
Yes, sir. Please. The mic is coming to you.
Even if you don't have someone to vote for, vote against, and then you'll see who the someone is. Sorry.
Dr. Tharoor, majority of people are voting for you, opposition. 63% people voted for opposition. What are you doing? Why you are not uniting?
Sir, I can't speak for those who have... the fact is, there are a number of parties. Look, the thing about the seat sharing issue, which is what you're alluding to, is that it has to be done on a state-by-state basis. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. I'm afraid that's the way our country is, because each state has its own politics and its own political history. So, for example, in my state of Kerala, two constituents of the India Alliance are duking it out, as they've done for the last 60 years, and that's a CPM-led Left Front and the Congress-led United Democratic Front, and they will never come to an agreement. They're not even beginning to talk about seat sharing. But right next door to my state, next door in Tamil Nadu, the CPM, the CPI, the Congress and the DMK are all hunky-dory in a very secure alliance, and they're not expecting any problems in going ahead to the election. So if two neighboring states can have two such differing approaches involving two of the same parties, why should you be surprised that when you take the nationwide picture, there will be states where we agree and there will be states where we don't agree? I think at the end of the day, if we can give you the best possible candidates in as many places as possible to stand up against the BJP, and if you all vote with the intelligence you're showing here and say you want to vote for those who represent the views you have and are critical of the views you dislike, you will get the parliamentary majority you seek for the opposition.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Shashi sir.
Hello.
As my opinion, India is the most democratic country. But you are saying save democracy. It is a save democracy or save opponent. Because you should say revive democracy. Because opposition not have any fact against government, but saying save democracy and quarrel each other. What is this?
I take that as an editorial comment, which you're entitled to say, because we are a democracy, so by all means have your say. I will say that I think that the reasons have been spelled out in Indrajit Roy's book and in the questions and answers you've heard. So why we believe democracy is in need of saving.
Last question, please.
Do you think the present government is following the blueprints of Ms. Gandhi's regarding democracy when she added socialism and secularism in the constitution without the rubber stamp's consent you were talking about?
Oh, you're asking me, obviously, yeah. Look, I'm not a fan of the emergency, and I've said so at the time, and I've written, books and articles in which my stand is known, so I'm not going to go over that ground again. But as I said when I was challenged at the time I entered politics in 2009, I said I'm not fighting the elections of 1977, I'm fighting the elections of 2009, and now this is the party that I believe embodies India's democracy the best. On the question of introducing words like socialism and secularism, frankly, I think ultimately, whether the words are there or not, the nature of the Constitution is pretty clear. If you take secularism, what makes the Indian Constitution secular are Articles 25 to 28, which give you freedom of worship, freedom of assembly, freedom to propagate your own religion. You've got that, then whether one word is there or not is not going to take away the right to be somebody who practices a different faith from that of the majority, and who can propagate that faith and worship in places of his choice, and so on and so forth. That's all guaranteed by the Constitution of India. And therefore, I would say that one word alone, whether it's added or withdrawn or whatever, is not going to change the nature of the Constitution. The Constitution is the text itself, it's the way it's been interpreted over all these years, it's judgments of the Supreme Court over all these years. All of that has given us a secular constitution, whether some people like it or not.
I'm just going to end with a quick, short passage from Indrajit Roy's book and give him the last word. When people ask, why are you fighting if it's a losing battle and so on? Well, you've talked about Arjuna on the battlefield. And, when Krishna tells Arjun, whether you win the war or you lose it is immaterial. What matters is that he fights in it and does not let injustice go unchallenged. And that essentially is what you're saying in the book.
Absolutely.
And you have a message from somebody that you want to read out today.
I mean, on that note, you're familiar with what is being done to civil rights activist Harsh Mandar. And one would expect that Harsh is sort of, been cowed down. But if anything, he's got words to share with everyone here, which I'd like to read out. The Indian Republic is passing through its darkest hour, with hate and inequality swelling like an epidemic. Those who love this country must join hands to fight and build a land that is equal and kind. I share the hope that's been spelled out in this book, a hope that goodness will prevail, that justice will prevail, as Krishna would have it. That, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of history is long, but in the end, it will bend towards justice. We don't know what the outcome is, but we know we must continue the struggle.
A big round of applause for Indrajit Roy. Congratulations on your book. And to Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much for being a very enthusiastic audience on a rainy day. Thank you.